Ethan was sitting with his son, Max, on a delayed flight. They were waiting for the plane to take off, but it had been an hour with no explanation. Max, with his big blue eyes, asked, "Dad, why aren't we flying yet?" Ethan smiled and said, "I don't know, buddy. Sometimes things take time." Just then, an old man walked slowly down the aisle. He had trouble walking, and his leg dragged a little. He looked tired and struggled with his heavy bag. Some people in the cabin looked at him with sympathy, but the man sitting near the front just stared at him. As the old man walked past the wealthy man sitting near the front, his bag accidentally brushed against the rich man's chair. The rich man, wearing a fancy suit, glared at him and said, "Watch where you're going. Do you even know what you're doing?" The old man apologized quietly, but the rich man was angry. "Why do they let people like you on planes? You're a danger to everyone." Ethan felt angry when he heard those mean words. He looked around, and other people seemed uncomfortable too, but no one said anything. Ethan took a deep breath and tried to stay calm for Max's sake. The old man tried to put his bag in the overhead compartment, but it was too heavy, and it fell onto the rich man's head. The rich man jumped up, furious. "What do you think you're doing? You almost hurt me with that bag." The old man apologized again, his hands shaking. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." But the rich man kept yelling, "Why are you even here? You're a danger." Ethan couldn't stay quiet anymore. He stood up and said, "That's enough. This man deserves respect, not your insults." The rich man turned to Ethan and said, "Who do you think you are? This isn't your business." Ethan replied, "It is everyone's business when someone is being treated unfairly. This man is a veteran who fought to protect this country. He deserves respect, not scorn." The plane went quiet. More people started speaking up in support of Ethan. One person said, "He's right. Show some respect." Another added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." A flight attendant came over and said, "Sir, please calm down and be respectful to other passengers." Ethan turned to Max and said, "We're going to give up our seats so this gentleman can sit here. You can sit on my lap." Max agreed. Ethan helped the old man sit in the seat next to them, and Max sat on his lap. The rich man was still angry, but didn't say anything. Ethan and Max moved to the back of the plane, where the old man followed slowly, looking relieved. A flight attendant helped everyone get settled. Ethan asked Max, "Are you okay, buddy?" Max looked at the old man and asked, "Dad, who is that man?" Ethan smiled and said, "He's a very special person, Max." The old man looked at Ethan and said, "Thank you again. You didn't have to do this." Ethan smiled back. "It's no trouble at all. We're happy to help." The old man smiled. "I'm Thomas. It's a pleasure to meet you both." As the flight went on, Ethan noticed Thomas's hat. It looked like a military hat. "That's an interesting hat," Ethan said. "Were you in the military?" Thomas smiled. "Yes, I served for many years. It feels like a lifetime ago." Max, always curious, asked, "Did you fight in wars?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, I fought in World War II and the Korean War." Ethan was amazed. "That's incredible. Thank you for your service." Thomas waved his hand. "I did what I had to do, just like so many others." Max looked at Thomas with wide eyes. "Did you get hurt?" Thomas paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I got this limb from a bullet wound. There are still some pieces of shrapnel in my leg." Ethan and Max listened closely as Thomas began to tell them about his experiences. "I remember one battle in Korea," Thomas said. "We were ambushed, and it was chaos everywhere. My best friend, James, and I were fighting together." Ethan asked, "What happened to James?" Thomas looked sad. "James didn't make it. He saved my life, but he was hit. I carry his memory with me every day." Ethan felt a deep sadness for Thomas. "I'm so sorry. That must have been really hard." Thomas nodded. "War leaves scars, not just on the body, but on the heart. I've lost many friends, and those memories never fade." Ethan asked softly, "What was it like being in the middle of it all?" Thomas took a deep breath. "It was terrifying and exciting. You never knew if you'd make it to the next day, but we had each other, and that made it easier. We were like brothers." The plane hit a little turbulence, and Max held on to Ethan, a little scared. Thomas reached over and patted Max's hand. "It's okay, little one. Just a little bump." Max smiled and said, "Thank you, Mr. Thomas." Thomas smiled back. "You're very welcome, Max." As the flight went on, Ethan thanked the flight attendant for helping them switch seats. "Thank you for making things more comfortable." The flight attendant smiled. "I'm glad we could help. Is there anything else you need?" Ethan shook his head. "We're fine, thank you." As the flight continued, Ethan felt moved by Thomas's stories. He felt a deep connection to him, and Thomas's kindness made him feel calm and inspired. Max, still curious, pointed to Thomas's bag. "Mr. Thomas, what's that?" Ethan gently reminded Max. "It's not polite to ask about other people's things." Thomas smiled. "It's okay. He's just curious." He reached in his bag and pulled out a photo album. "This is a collection of memories from my time in the military." Max's eyes lit up. "Can we see?" Thomas nodded. "Of course." Ethan and Max leaned in as Thomas opened the album. The pages were filled with black and white photos, each one telling a story. Thomas carefully turned the pages, pointing to one. "This is from World War II, he said. "We were just kids back then, full of hope." Ethan looked at the photo. "Who are they?" Thomas smiled sadly. "These were my friends. We went through a lot together." "That's James," he said, pointing to a tall man in the photo. "He was my best friend." As Thomas spoke about James, Ethan noticed how much he missed him. "James saved my life more times than I can count," Thomas said. "There was one time in Korea when we were ambushed, and he pulled me out of the line of fire." Ethan felt a lump in his throat as he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, but Thomas just nodded. "War leaves scars," Thomas said quietly. "Not just on the body, but also on the heart. I still have shrapnel in my leg from that day, but the real pain is losing friends like James." Max, who had been listening quietly, reached out and touched Thomas's arm. "Did it hurt a lot, Mr. Thomas?" he asked. Thomas smiled gently at Max. "Yes, Max, it did. But we did it because we believed in protecting our country and each other." Thomas turned another page of his photo album. Ethan's eyes caught one photo of Thomas and James. They were both smiling, even though there was war all around them. Ethan felt like he knew James's face from somewhere. It was like it was in his family's old photo albums. "Who took this picture?" Ethan asked, pointing to the photo. "One of our fellow soldiers," Thomas said. "It was taken just a few days before the ambush. We were so happy then, thinking we might actually make it home." Ethan looked at the photo again, feeling like something was familiar about James. His heart started to race. He asked, "Do you have any other photos of James?" Thomas nodded and flipped through the album. He paused at another photo. "This one was taken right before the ambush," he said. "James and I had a feeling something was coming, but we wanted to keep our spirits up." Ethan looked closely at the man in the photo. He looked just like his grandfather. Ethan could hardly believe it. He had seen his grandfather's face in old family pictures when he was younger. His voice shook as he spoke. "Thomas," he said, "I think James might be my grandfather." Thomas's eyes went wide with surprise. "Your grandfather?" Ethan nodded, tears filling his eyes. "I remember seeing pictures of him when I was a child. My mom told me stories about how he saved lives during the war, but he never came home." Thomas's face softened with surprise and sadness. "If James was your grandfather, then I owe him my life. He was the bravest man I ever knew." Ethan felt a rush of emotions. His grandfather, the man he had heard so many stories about, had saved Thomas's life. He felt proud and thankful. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, wiping his tears. "Thank you for telling me this. I never knew the full story." Thomas reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you for listening and for letting me remember. Your grandfather was a hero. It's an honor to have known him." Max, who had been listening, asked his dad, "Dad, is Mr. Thomas talking about Grandpa?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Max, Mr. Thomas knew your great-grandpa. He was very brave." The rest of the flight felt blurry for Ethan. He and Thomas kept talking, sharing memories and stories. As the plane landed, Ethan felt nervous but excited. He had something important to do once they got off the plane. When they got to the airport, Ethan turned to Thomas. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice shaking with excitement, "I have a favor to ask. Would you come with Max and me for a short trip? There's someone I want you to meet." Thomas looked curious. "Where are we going?" Ethan smiled. "It's not far. Just a short drive. I think you'll be glad you came." After thinking for a moment, Thomas nodded. "All right, Ethan. I trust you." They gathered their things and walked out of the terminal. Ethan felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was something he hadn't planned for, but it felt like the right thing to do. They walked to the parking lot, and Ethan helped Thomas into the car. Max climbed into the back seat. The drive was quiet at first, with the car humming softly. Thomas looked out the window, curious. "Where are we going?" he asked again. "You'll see," Ethan said with a smile, sharing a look with Max, who giggled softly. They finally arrived at a small, pretty house. It looked old but cozy, with a well-kept garden and a welcoming porch. Ethan's heart raced as they walked up to the door. "This is where I grew up," Ethan said. "My mom still lives here." He opened the door and led Thomas inside. The house smelled warm and familiar. In the kitchen, Ethan's mom, Claire, was making tea. She smiled when she saw them. "Hi, Mom," Ethan greeted, giving her a hug. "This is Thomas." "Thomas, this is my mom, Claire." Claire extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, Thomas." "Nice to meet you too," Thomas replied, shaking her hand. Before anyone could say more, an older man came into the room. He walked slowly, but with a strong presence. When he saw Thomas, both men's faces lit up. "James?" Thomas whispered in shock. "Thomas?" The old man, James, asked, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, with joy, the two men hugged tightly, tears streaming down their faces. "I thought you were gone," Thomas said, his voice shaking. James pulled back and smiled, his eyes full of emotion. "I was for a while, but I made it back, and now here we are." Ethan felt his heart fill with happiness. This was why he had brought Thomas here. He looked at Max, who was wide-eyed, understanding the importance of the moment. James and Thomas sat down, still holding each other's hands, and began sharing stories from their past. "Do you remember that time in Normandy?" James asked, smiling through his tears. Thomas laughed. "How could I forget? We were so scared, but we made it through." James nodded. "In Korea," he said, his voice getting quieter. "You saved my life more times than I can count." "No," Thomas said, shaking his head. "It was you who saved me. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." As the two old friends kept talking, laughing, and crying together, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. He had not only learned more about his family's history, but had also reunited two old friends. As the night went on, James and Thomas continued sharing stories. Finally, James leaned back and smiled. "Thomas, I never told you how I survived that day in Korea," he said. Thomas's eyes grew wide. "I always wondered. I saw you get hit, and then I didn't see you again. I thought you were gone." James nodded. "It was close. After I pulled you out of the line of fire, I got hit. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a field hospital. A nurse saved my life. Her name was Margaret." Thomas's face lit up. "That's incredible. What happened next?" James smiled. "Well, Margaret wouldn't give up on me. She kept pushing the doctors to help me. We spent a lot of time together while I was recovering. Eventually, we fell in love. She's my wife now. We've been together ever since." Thomas smiled widely. "That's wonderful, James. I'm so happy for you." James nodded, his eyes filled with happiness. "She's been my rock. We've had a good life together. I never thought I'd find happiness like this after the war." Ethan, who had been listening quietly, spoke softly. "It's amazing how love can find us in the most unexpected places." Thomas nodded. "It's stories like yours that give me hope. After the war, I struggled to find my place. I wandered for a while, trying to figure things out. But eventually, I found a job and settled down. I guess I needed closure." James reached out and grabbed Thomas's hand. They started talking easily, laughing, and sometimes getting a little teary-eyed as they remembered old times. They told stories about the friends they had lost and the happy and sad moments they had shared. As the night went on, things got quieter, and James looked at Thomas. His voice was full of feeling. "You know, I spent years thinking you were dead. It was so hard to live with that," he said. Thomas nodded, his eyes getting watery. "I know. I saw you get shot, and I thought that was the end. Losing you was like losing a part of me. But now, seeing you here, it feels like fate brought us back together." Ethan watched the two men, feeling proud. He was happy that he helped bring them back together. "Maybe it was fate," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe I was meant to meet Ethan and come here. It's like we needed to close that chapter in our lives. James smiled, his eyes sparkling. I believe that too. Now that we're together again, let's make the most of it. The night ended, and the next morning, the house smelled like breakfast. James and Thomas sat at the table, talking like no time had passed. In the days that followed, they spent time together, eating meals, going for walks, and talking for hours. They laughed about old memories and made new ones, enjoying every minute. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to Thomas. You know, Thomas, we should go on a trip together, visit some of the places where we fought, and pay our respects, James said. Thomas smiled big, his eyes lighting up. I'd love that. It would be a great trip. Ethan and Claire, who overheard, came outside to join them. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Ethan said. You both deserve it. Claire nodded. We'll help you plan it. It'll be a trip you'll never forget. James and Thomas smiled at each other, excited. Let's do it for old time's sake, James said. In the next week, they made plans for the trip, looking at maps and talking about the places they wanted to visit. Ethan and Claire helped with everything, making sure all the details were taken care of. When Thomas was getting ready to leave to pack for the trip, he hugged Ethan and Claire tightly. Thank you for everything. This has been more than I could have ever hoped for, he said. Ethan smiled, his eyes full of tears. It's been our pleasure. You're part of our family now. Max, who had been listening, looked up at Thomas with big eyes. Will you come back and visit us, Mr. Thomas? He asked. Thomas knelt down, smiling kindly. Of course, Max. I'll be back before you know it, and I'll have lots of stories to tell. As Thomas and James drove away for their trip, Ethan and Claire stood watching, feeling happy. They had helped bring two old friends together again, and it felt like a dream. A few weeks later, Ethan stood on the porch, looking down the road. He was excited for today. Max was bouncing next to him, full of energy. Do you think they had fun, Dad? Max asked. I'm sure they did, buddy, Ethan said, smiling. Soon, a familiar car appeared, and Max couldn't wait any longer. He ran to greet it. The car stopped, and Thomas and James stepped out, looking happy and full of energy. Grandpa, Mr. Thomas, Max yelled, his voice full of joy. James picked Max up into a big hug. Hello, buddy. We missed you. Thomas smiled at Max's excitement. Hi there, Max. We have so many stories to tell you. Ethan walked over to them, his heart full of happiness. Welcome home, he said, hugging both of them. You look great. It was an amazing trip, James said, his eyes twinkling. That evening, they all sat around the dinner table, sharing stories. Claire had made a big meal, and the house smelled wonderful. Everyone felt so happy and close. So, tell us everything, Claire said, eager to hear about their trip. James and Thomas smiled at each other, and Thomas started. We went to Normandy first. Standing on those beaches again was amazing. We remembered our friends and honored them. It was very emotional. James nodded. Then we went to Korea and visited old battlefields. It wasn't just about the places, it was about the people we met, fellow soldiers and their families. It was a journey of healing. Thomas grinned, looking at James. And we had some fun too. Remember that night in Paris, James? James Maxled. How could I forget? We stayed out late in a cafe, talking to the locals until morning. It felt like we were young again. Max, who had been listening closely, suddenly spoke up. Grandpa, Mr. Thomas, when I grow up, I want to be a soldier like you. I want to be brave and help people too. The room went quiet for a moment. Then, James leaned forward with a proud smile. That's a wonderful dream, Max. Being a soldier is about more than just bravery. It's about honor and looking out for your friends. Thomas nodded, smiling at Max. That's right. And if you choose that path, you'll have your family's support. We believe in you, Max. Max smiled big, feeling proud. Thanks, Grandpa. Thanks, Mr. Thomas. I want to be just like you. James and Thomas shared a warm look, touched by Max's words. James reached out and ruffled Max's hair. You already have the heart of a soldier, little man. Just keep being kind and brave, and you'll do great things. Thomas smiled. And don't forget, it's also important to enjoy the journey and the people you meet along the way. Claire, who had been watching this moment between Max and the men, smiled warmly. Looks like Max has some great role models, she said. As the evening went on, the stories kept flowing, each one making them all laugh and remember good times. It was clear that the trip had changed both James and Thomas. They felt lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted. At the end of the meal, Ethan cleared his throat and looked at Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "Thomas, we've been talking, and we'd like to ask you something." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Ethan looked at James, who nodded, encouraging him. "We'd like you to stay with us, permanently." James needs someone close to him, someone who understands him. "We'd love to have you as part of our family." Thomas was surprised. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be a burden at all," James said firmly. "We've spent so many years apart, thinking the other was gone. Now that we're together again, I don't want to waste another moment." Claire nodded. "You become part of our lives, Thomas. It would mean everything to us if you stayed." Thomas looked around at the faces of everyone. James, Claire, Ethan, and little Max. His heart felt full. "I'd be honored," he said softly. "Thank you. Thank you all." Max clapped his hands, excited. "Yay, Mr. Thomas is staying." That night, as they settled into the living room, Thomas felt at home. He was surrounded by people who cared about him, people who understood his past and shared in the joy of his present. James raised a glass. "To family, old and new, and to the memories we've made and the ones we'll keep making." Everyone raised their glasses, and the sound of the clinking glasses was a sign of hope and togetherness. Thomas looked around, feeling peaceful. He had found his place, not just in a house, but in the hearts of the people who welcomed him. The journey that had started with an unexpected trip had brought him to a new beginning, filled with love, laughter, and many more stories to come. As the night ended, Ethan watched James and Thomas talk quietly, both of them glowing with happiness. He felt thankful for the journey that had brought them all together. And in the quiet of the night, surrounded by the love of family, Thomas knew he was finally home. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like it, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest, inspiring and heartwarming stories and have the opportunity to engage with our growing community. Additionally, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comment section below. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more captivating narratives with you.